Daniel had learned early that silence could carry weight, and on the morning he packed his bag to leave his childhood home in Oregon, that silence followed him from room to room like a shadow that knew his shape, because his father, Thomas, stood by the window pretending to read the newspaper while already knowing this goodbye would not be simple, and Daniel, now a grown man with a steady job waiting in Seattle, felt the familiar pull between who he was becoming and who he had always been in. This house where grief still lived softly after his mother's death, where nothing loud ever happened anymore, only careful movements and polite smiles, and as Daniel paused in the hallway, he remembered how his life had changed the year before, not with noise or drama, but with a feeling that arrived quietly the day he met Claire in a small bookstore during a rainstorm, when she smiled at him over a stack of used novels and spoke with warmth that made him feel less alone than he had felt in years, and from that moment his days began to feel fuller, brighter, more hopeful, as if something long missing had finally found him, and Daniel, who had always believed love was something practical and slow like his father, discovered that love could also be gentle and alive, something that made him look forward to mornings and linger in conversations, and when he told Thomas about Claire, his father listened without comment, nodding in his usual thoughtful way, offering advice only when asked. But when Daniel brought Claire home for the first time, something changed in the air, something Daniel could not name at first, because Thomas was kind and respectful, welcoming her with quiet charm, asking about her work, offering coffee, but Daniel noticed how his father seemed more present than usual, how his words were carefully chosen, how his eyes followed Claire not with desire that crossed lines, but with a softness Daniel had not seen since his mother was alive, and Daniel pushed the thought away because it felt wrong to question his father's intentions, because Thomas was a man of strong morals, a man who built his life on doing what was right even when it was hard, and yet, over the next few visits, Daniel felt a subtle tension grow, not between him and Claire, but within himself, because love, when it is honest, leaves traces, and Daniel saw those traces in small moments, in the way Thomas listened when Claire spoke about her childhood, in how he smiled at her jokes even when he barely smiled at anything else, and Daniel began to understand that something fragile and unspoken was forming, something no one had chosen, something no one had invited, and the understanding sat heavy in his chest, because Daniel loved Claire deeply, but he also loved his father, and suddenly love no longer felt simple, it felt like a responsibility, a choice that could hurt someone no matter how carefully it was handled, and as Daniel drove away that morning toward a future he thought he understood, the memory of those moments followed him, and he realized that the secret had already begun, not with words or confessions, but with awareness, with the quiet agreement between father and son that some feelings, once recognized, must be carried with care, never exposed, never acted upon, and as the miles stretched between Daniel and his childhood home, he did not yet know how deeply that secret would shape his life, only that it was already alive, breathing in the space between love and restraint, waiting for the moment it would demand more than silence. After Claire became a regular part of Daniel's life, everything began to move faster, not in events but in emotions, because love has a way of speeding up the heart even when days look normal, and Daniel found himself balancing work in Seattle with weekend trips back home, bringing Claire along more often, believing that sharing the people he loved would make his world feel complete, but instead it created a quiet tension that followed them like a low hum, because Thomas remained respectful and distant on the surface, yet Daniel noticed how his father's routines changed when Claire was near, how he stayed awake later, how he fixed small things around the house that had been broken for years, how he listened more than he spoke, and Daniel, who had always read people well, began to sense that his father was fighting something inside himself, something he did not want but could not ignore. And this awareness made Daniel restless, because love should feel safe, not divided, and yet there he was, standing between two people whose feelings were pulling in opposite directions, and one evening, after Claire left early to meet a friend, the house fell into a silence that felt heavier than usual, and Thomas finally spoke, his voice calm but worn, telling Daniel that life sometimes places us in situations we never ask for, where the right choice is not the easy one. And Daniel understood what his father was saying without hearing the words directly, because truth does not always need full sentences, and when Thomas admitted that his feelings were real but unwanted, that he had no intention of acting on them, Daniel felt both relief and heartbreak at the same time, because knowing his father's pain made his own love feel complicated, and from that night on, Daniel carried a quiet burden, watching his father step back emotionally, creating distance, leaving rooms early, avoiding conversations with Claire, not out of coldness but out of respect, and Daniel admired him deeply for it. Yet admiration did not erase the guilt that followed Daniel everywhere, because he could see the cost of that restraint, the loneliness in his father's eyes, the way he returned to old habits of silence and routine, and as weeks passed, Daniel tried to focus on his relationship with Claire, taking her out, planning small trips, speaking about the future, but something had shifted inside him, because love now felt shared even when it wasn't, and Daniel began to question whether happiness built on someone else's sacrifice could ever feel clean, and Claire sensed the change too, noticing Daniel's distant moments, his pauses mid-sentence, his distracted gaze, and though she never accused him of anything, her quiet concern made everything harder, because Daniel wanted to be honest, yet honesty would expose a truth that could hurt everyone involved, and so he stayed silent, believing silence was still the safest option. But the weight of that silence grew heavier each day, and Daniel found himself awake at night replaying moments, wondering if love always demanded loss, or if some stories were never meant to unfold fully, and as winter approached and the days grew shorter, Daniel realized that part 2 of his life was not about falling in love, but about understanding the cost of it, because love, when mixed with loyalty and restraint, does not explode, it slowly presses inward, testing how much the heart can hold before something has to give. As months passed, Daniel felt the weight of the unspoken tension pressing harder on his heart, because every smile he shared with Claire carried a shadow of awareness about his father's quiet struggle, and every visit home reminded him that love could be both a gift and a burden, and he began to notice the small ways his own feelings were changing, subtle shifts that he tried to ignore but could not, because love, once complicated by loyalty, never stays simple. And one evening, after a long day at work, Daniel invited Claire to walk along the waterfront, the city lights reflecting on the gentle waves, the air filled with a soft chill that made them huddle closer, talking about everything and nothing. When Daniel realized he could no longer pretend that the emotional weight he carried was just about circumstance, that something deeper had shifted inside him, that the closeness he felt toward Claire was now mixed with guilt, with longing for a peace he had never allowed himself to fully embrace, and as he spoke, his voice steady but laced with a quiet ache, he told her that he could not continue their relationship, that it was not her fault, not anyone's fault, but that love sometimes demands choices that break the heart in order to honor what is right, and Claire's eyes filled with understanding and heartbreak at the same time, because she had come to care deeply for Daniel, yet she saw the honesty in his words, and she knew that this was the only way to preserve the integrity of the bond he shared with his father, who had already sacrificed so much out of care and restraint. And Daniel walked home that night with a strange mix of sorrow and relief, because speaking the truth had lifted a burden but had also opened a new emptiness, a quiet ache that would follow him for weeks and months. And when he returned to his father's house, Thomas immediately noticed the change, the subtle shift in Daniel's demeanor, the way he moved through the house with careful steps, the soft way he avoided certain topics. And when Daniel finally explained what had happened, Thomas only nodded gently, understanding without judgment, because he too had carried a secret that could never be spoken aloud, a love that had never acted on itself, and in that shared understanding, father and son found a delicate peace, a bond strengthened not by shared joy but by shared sacrifice, by the recognition that some feelings must remain unspoken to protect the people we love most. And Daniel realized that part of growing up was learning that love is not always about possession or fulfillment, but sometimes about choosing what is right even when it hurts. And as the days turned into weeks, he watched Claire move forward with grace, saw his father return to small routines with a quiet dignity, and felt the bittersweet truth settle in, that love could exist without crossing lines, that happiness could come at a cost, and that the deepest connections are often hidden in the spaces between words, in the choices we make silently, in the quiet loyalty that binds hearts together even when life demands restraint. And Daniel carried that lesson with him, knowing that some secrets, though painful, were also sacred, because they preserved the integrity of love, honor, and family, and in that knowledge, he began to heal while holding close the memory of what could never be spoken but would always remain a part of him. Years moved forward like water, steady and inevitable, And Daniel found himself building a life that felt both full and peaceful, because he had learned to live with the quiet ache of the secret he carried, a weight that never left but had become part of the rhythm of his days, and love returned to him, gentle and uncomplicated, with someone who met him where he was, unburdened by the past, while Thomas aged gracefully, tending to his garden, reading quietly, and finding joy in small routines that brought him comfort. Yet on certain evenings, when the light softened and the world slowed, Daniel would catch himself remembering Claire, the bookstore where they first met, the rain on that day, the way laughter had once felt effortless, and he realized that the secret he had shared with his father, unspoken, unacted upon, yet profoundly present, was a testament not to regret but to love's complexity, because it had taught him restraint, empathy, and the meaning of selfless care. And even as life moved on, he and Thomas maintained a bond strengthened by unvoiced understanding, a silent agreement that some feelings, though powerful, were not meant to disrupt lives but to exist quietly, respected and honored in the hearts of those involved. And Daniel watched his father sometimes pause in thought, eyes soft, aware that both of them had lived through something rare and delicate, a love that could not claim its own happiness yet shaped them in ways that rippled through their choices, their compassion, and their ability to love again without shadow. And he understood that the secret would never need retelling, because it was preserved in gestures, in subtle glances, in the shared knowledge that love is sometimes about letting go, about choosing what is right over what is wanted, about protecting others even when the heart aches. And as Daniel moved forward in life, embracing the new love he had found and the steady happiness he now enjoyed, he carried with him the profound lesson of Part 4, that some stories do not need an ending spelled aloud to matter, that the deepest truths are often those that live quietly between hearts, that the bond between a father and son can be enriched by understanding, sacrifice, and the unspoken, and that honoring a secret of the heart can become its own form of love, leaving a legacy of tenderness, respect, and emotional strength that neither time nor distance could ever diminish, because the most enduring connections are built not just on what is spoken, but on what is held in reverent silence. And Daniel finally embraced that truth fully, feeling peace in knowing that some love, even when it cannot be claimed, can transform life, shape character, and leave an indelible mark on the soul. And as he watched the sun set from his own home, he understood that the secret between him and his father was not a burden but a quiet, sacred gift, a reminder that love in its purest form sometimes asks only for honor, patience, and the courage to carry it silently through all the years to come.